Okay, so one of the assessment objectives that you are tested on for paper 2, the prose paper, is A04, exploring connections across literary texts. So for students preparing for this exam, it's really important that when you're studying The Little Stranger and Dracula, you are looking for links and connections between these two texts, primarily under the theme of the supernatural. So what we did in my class is we started to think about what some of the gothic or supernatural concerns are in any gothic or supernatural piece of fiction, and then we started to think about how those themes related to the two texts we were studying. So this is a kind of top tip for revision, really, in sort of drawing these ideas together in a practical way. I'm going to suggest that one activity you could do is to create a mind map for each of the following gothic or supernatural concerns. And on each of these mind maps, you would make notes in relation to both of your set texts, ideally using a different colour just to distinguish between the two, and to make sure you're approaching each text in a balanced and kind of equal way. So if I just talk you through some of these gothic and supernatural concerns, hopefully it'll be a bit clearer about some of the things you might explore. So first and foremost, I asked my students to mind map the idea of the supernatural in both of our novels. So how is the supernatural handled? Is it explained or unexplained? In our two set texts, Bram Stoker's Dracula and Sarah Waters' The Little Stranger, we have an example of both of those types of supernatural occurrences. So in Dracula, obviously, the Count is fully explained as a supernatural being and is accepted by the other characters in the novel as being other, as being supernatural. Whereas in The Little Stranger, it's a little less clear. There is an ambiguity surrounding to what extent the events that take place in the novel are supernatural, or whether Dr. Faraday has a key role to play there in the misfortunes and happenings. That's something that is left rather ambiguous at the end, although during a recent interview with Sarah Waters for the Guardian Book Club, she does actually say that the Little Stranger is the Doctor, sort of alluding to this idea that he is in part responsible for the strange happenings in Hundreds Hall. So there are still elements of that novel that aren't quite fully explained and still feel rather supernatural, but this issue of the Doctor and his role is something that complicates this theme. What I would do is try and think of what supernatural events occur in both of your two texts, look for those key moments in the novels, and start to think about how these supernatural events are described by the writer, and that will give you a chance to explore the writer's craft. A02, the expectation there is that you explore and examine, evaluate, analyse the writer's craft at work. So there's an opportunity for you to do some close textual analysis. And also I would start to think about what these supernatural events are trying to say about certain contextual concerns at the time the novels are set. So you might look at how the supernatural in Dracula is used to explore Victorian fears of degeneration, loose morality, the fear of the new woman, etc. And in The Little Stranger, you might make some links between how the supernatural events encapsulate a general kind of fear of uncertainty regarding the future of Britain, particularly for families like the Eyres under the new Labour government and the kind of drive for social reform. So a lot of work to do there with regards to that particular theme. I then do a totally different separate mind map for setting in place, and again look for key locations and what they are used to symbolise in the texts themselves, looking for how both writers create and generate unsettling spaces. There are some lovely links you can make actually between Hundreds Hall and Count Dracula's castle, both in the way it is described but also in the ideas that they represent a sort of foreign world, a landscape in which people feel alienated and isolated from the rest of society. There's lots to be exploring there, and many links can be made. It's important to note when you look at setting in place with regards to the Little Stranger that almost all the action and narrative centres around just a single location, that of Hundreds Hall, whereas in Dracula there is definitely a more diverse use of setting in place. Just an interesting comparison. What does that perhaps signify? We can also look, of course, at the position of women and the position of men, presentations of femininity and masculinity in both these novels. That's always an interesting area to focus upon. And the importance of context there is hopefully fairly obvious, but definitely worth considering. We could also do a mind map that explores this clash really between the past and modernity, a very typical Gothic concern. That would be well worth looking at in both of the novels. Class relations arguably more easy to explore in The Little Stranger, more explicitly dealt with, but well worth thinking about in terms of Dracula as well. We do have some notable working class figures in that novel, and indeed the crew of light and what class in society they represent is quite important in terms of their heroic status and understanding the ideals that they embody. I think you could do some interesting analysis there. Of course, both our novels explore this idea of insanity in quite an explicit way. Renfield is the obvious character to look at in Dracula, but also Jonathan Harker's experiences in the castle lead him to become very unsure of his own thought processes and certainly feels as if he is out of control and losing a grip on his own rational mind. In The Little Stranger, you've of course got Roderick, Mrs. Eyres herself, but also the unstable nature of the Doctor is something you could perhaps look at there as well. Terror and horror is something that Gothic fiction deals with, this kind of distinction between psychological fear and a sort of more physical reaction to fear. In what ways are our two novels an exploration of psychological terror and fear as opposed to a more graphic horror? Repressed desires, it's such an important theme in both of our set texts, and and it operates on a number of levels. You could look at all the characters in both of the novels and explore this idea to a certain degree, looking at what their desires are, whether they are repressed or whether they are played out. I mean, thinking of Count Dracula, to what degree does he repress any of his desires is debatable. He kind of embodies the dangers of following your desires, your innate instincts, particularly sexual. There's lots there that's very, very interesting to look at in both of the novels, and well worth doing a mind map on that one, identifying some key quotes and thinking about how each of the characters relate to this idea of desire. Death as a feature and of Gothic novels is something you could explore, but also it directly relates to this idea of the supernatural and what happens after death. That might be worth looking at. I've definitely seen an example question where students were asked to compare the presentation of death, or the threat of death, I think it was, so one worth looking at. Equally, the hauntings, the idea of hauntings and the past coming back to haunt you is an interesting area for further consideration. Both literal hauntings by ghosts and also metaphorical hauntings and disturbances. I think that's something you could look at quite well in both of the set novels that we've got. And finally, fear, the idea of evoking fear. What fears are explored in both of these texts. You need to think quite carefully about the context of both of the novels, the time at which they were set, and perhaps even looking in terms of Sarah Waters, the time at which the novel was written, if we're to believe that Gothic texts gain popularity in times of transition, in times of turmoil. Thinking about 2009, so the late 2000s, when Sarah Waters wrote her novel, might be quite insightful, thinking about what's happening at the time and why she might have chosen to write a text with some explicit Gothic content. So anyway, I hope you find that useful. It's just an idea that we had about trying to make explicit links between our two texts in preparation for the exam.